Whether you're in a new property or an old property, at some point you're going to end up with a squeaking floorboards, which start out small but gradually they get louder, and before long they get right on your nerves. So this week I'm going to show you how to sort them out for good. Squeaky floorboards are one of those things that can drive you completely barking mad once it starts getting a little bit louder, and once you notice it you can't unnotice it, especially in the middle of the night when you can be woken up by someone moving around the house. And it doesn't matter if you're in a new or an old property. This property is 3 years old, it's brand new when we moved in, and we didn't have any squeaks to start with, but gradually over time they've developed, especially around this doorway, where it's now got to the point where I've got to do something about it because it's just starting to wake people up. The first thing you mustn't do if you're trying to fix a squeaking floorboard is to drive a screw through the carpet, through the floorboard and into a joist. You have no idea what you're aiming at with that screw, and you could quite easily damage a cable or, more likely, a water pipe, which would make it a really bad day. So I'd always advise taking up the carpet, having a look at the floorboards to see what's happening, because there's a couple of different ways of fixing them. If you've got a squeak underneath tiles or like a hardwood floor, then I've got some ideas later in this video on how to fix this. But at the moment we're looking at this area where I've got a squeak somewhere around this corner. So I think the first thing I need to do is take up the carpet. Standard carpet in the UK is held down with what's called gripper strips around the perimeter. When it's laid, it's first stretched into place, but after a bit it relaxes, which means it's usually pretty easy to pull up from a corner. The underlay can be glued or more commonly stapled in place underneath the carpet like mine is here, so it's fairly easy to remove the staples as you go. And as I removed the threshold strip here, it was obviously never fixed properly by the carpet layer. A little tip here for working out what you've got in the void between the ceiling and the floor. If you've got downlighters, like a lot of people have these days, you can remove them and have a look up into the void to see what you can see. If you can't see much, there's a good chance you'll be able to slip a mobile phone up into that void and take a few photos, which might give you a clue on what's in it. So now I've raised the carpet and had a look at exactly what I've got, I'm actually changing my mind on the problem that I've actually got here. I'm not quite sure what sort of board this is. This is some sort of synthetic floorboard, but it looks like it's been put down pretty well, and it's been glued and screwed or nailed along each beam and to each other. So the more I look at it, the more I seem to think that I've got a problem between the floorboards and this wall. I think this is one of those occasions where you can only really see what you're getting at once you've sort of uncovered it, and it's not as straightforward or as easy as I thought it was going to be. So let's go into the workshop and I'll show you where I think this creak is coming from. So this is essentially a mock-up of what I've got upstairs, excluding the door lining which covers all this timber and just makes it look nice. So I've got the stud partition that's actually making up the wall, then I've got the plasterboard and the skirting on either side. And the problem I think I've got is that this base plate is only pinned down, so you've got a little bit of movement, a little bit of rocking, and that's where this creaking is coming from. So I'm going to have to secure that to the flooring, which is at the moment my bench. The way I'm going to do that is, firstly, I'm going to take off the skirting so I can see and get closer to this piece of wood. Then I'm going to cut away the bottom of the plasterboard just enough so I can see the base timber. I don't want to cut it too high, because if I do, I'll be above the base plate and I'll start getting into the void of the wall, which isn't what I want. So probably just sort of 30 mil. And then with a drill, I can drill some holes at an angle. I'm going to drill it far enough in until I feel it punch out the bottom of the base plate and hit the floorboard. That means I've got a hole all the way through to the floorboard. And then I'm going to use some PU Gorilla Glue. Now this stuff expands, so if I force that in and push it in as much as possible, and get it into that void where the base plate meets the flooring, then that should expand, stick it all together and stop that nasty squeaking because the wall is moving relative to the floorboards. Now, a lot of people will have this problem in new build houses, although they probably won't recognise it. They'll think, just like me, that it's actually the floorboards moving. Now, if your floorboards are moving, there's another scenario that looks like this, and this is a pretty typical setup in a new build house. This is tongued and grooved chipboard flooring sitting on your joists, and all I've done is I've put a bit of a packer there which just brings it off, which means I've got a little bit of movement, which is exactly the sort of thing that ends up squeaking every time someone walks near it. And once again, the answer is to glue the joint, but this time there's no way we can use PU glue. It's just too viscous, it's too syrupy and heavy, and it's never going to penetrate those really fine joints you find in tongued and grooved chipboard. So we're going to need something a lot more watery, a bit like water. Even PVA glue isn't runny enough. So the thing that I would recommend to use is PVA wood glue watered down. I would recommend a 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1 dilution. It wants to be runny so it can get into all the nooks and crannies, but it also wants to be as strong as possible. I mix mine in a bottle that I can then squeeze out along the chipboard joints after cleaning the area as well as possible. To help it get down into the joints, just push up and down on the boards, which helps the liquid travel deeper and deeper, and then reapply and repeat until really you can't get any more in. So with as much glue as I can force into that joint as possible that's now gone into all those nooks and crannies, I'm going to weight the area down with whatever I can find, and then you need to leave it. You don't want to be walking around in the first hour or two because that could potentially break that really fragile glue bond. You want to leave it for a number of hours and just avoid the area. So while this is gaining some strength, let's go back up to the bedroom and I'll show you how I get on with the wall. To get to the plasterboard, I remove the gripper strip and use a multi-tool to cut through the sealant and glue holding the skirting on the wall. However, it looks like I don't really need it because this is the first skirting in my house that doesn't appear to have been glued on, just pinned. I find where the studs are and just for extra security pop in a couple of extra plasterboard screws before cutting away the bottom section with my multi-tool. There's plenty of movement there. So that's looking like I'm right. There's definitely plenty of movement between the floorboards and the studs or the bottom rail of this stud partition. It may be pinned in by 1 or 2 nails, but that's not enough to really stop it moving. So what I need to do now is to get some glue in between the floor and the bottom of this partition wall. On a piece of scrap timber, I drill some holes to see which size fits the nozzle of my glue the best. Then I remove a little bit more plasterboard so I can drill diagonal holes into the bottom section. As this glue relies on moisture to react, I spray a small amount of water into each hole before squeezing some in. I'm going to put a couple of these in. I'm going to act like wedges just to make sure that I've got a gap in between. And the idea is I'm going to squeeze this in as hard as I can into these 3 holes. It may or may not appear at the bottom, probably not at the moment, But when it does expand, I'm expecting to see evidence that it's come out the bottom. That gives me some sort of idea that it's done its job. Let's see how easy or hard it is to get some of this in. Oh, okay, so that was a bit too much. That's plenty. That definitely did flow better than I thought it was going to. Give it a big squeeze. I didn't realise I've got such a big gap now between the 4x2 and the floor that I can actually sort of force it in. There is a lot of glue there actually. There is plenty. I think we need to leave that to do its work. So I've left this around about 3 hours to expand and cure, and the good news is, as I walked in, I couldn't hear any creaking at all, so it looks like I've fixed the problem. But have a look to see what this has turned into. It's expanded quite nicely and is now pretty solid, so I think it's time that I can take these out and trim the front, just to get rid of the excess. Once this PU glue is fully dry, it's easy and quite satisfying to trim back. Since I put this expanding glue in, I haven't heard a sound from this area, no matter how I walk around it. So it's really solved the problem. And if you live in a relatively new property, you may find that what you think is a squeaky floorboard is actually the interface between the floor and partition wall moving against each other. Now, I did say at the beginning that I'd give you some tips on how to fix floors underneath things like tiles and hardwood floors. And I found a product on Amazon that does just that. I'll put a link in the description below, and I'm not sponsored by these people, but I think this is a really good idea. And the secret to it is in the nozzles. It comes with different types of nozzles, the most interesting one of which is like a syringe, which means that you can drill holes in the grout lines between tiles and then force the adhesive in to either fix loose tiles or the floorboard below. This type of adhesive works on tiles, marble, stone and wooden floors. Or the other alternative is you simply buy a syringe with a needle, a non-medical type. I'll put an Amazon link in the description below, the sort of thing that I've found, and fill it with your own adhesive or that watered down PVA. And that means that with the syringe you can still get in between the grout lines of any tiles, or to drill a 2 or 3 millimeter hole in hardwood flooring so you can get in and inject a load of adhesive, and a 2 or 3 millimeter hole you can fill really easily, and it's so small no one's ever going to see it in the future. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and it's given you some ideas on how to fix your own squeaking doors. Remember, subscribe, hit that bell notification, and I will see you next time.